Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a topic that's pretty much built into what it means to be human. Migration.
Yeah, migration, it's so much more than just people moving around, right? It's about ideas, mixing cultures, blending this like constant back and forth between, settling down and striking out for something new.
You know what's really wild? We've got these two books to guide us today. The Shortest History of Migration by Ian Goldin and Nomad Century by Gaia Vince, and they are packed with insights.
Oh, yeah, and Gaia Vince in Nomad Century, she just comes out and says it. Everyone's ancestors were migrants.
Whoa,
It's true. Think about it. If they hadn't moved, none of us would be here.
that's a powerful thought, isn't it? It really makes you rethink all those debates about migration today.
Totally. Like, whoa, we're all part of this huge story of movement, this interconnected journey.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock way back. Ian Goldin's book, he talks about some recent discoveries that are changing how we think about those early migrations out of Africa.
Oh, yeah, like that discovery in Germany. They found human remains dating back 45,000 years.
45,000 years.
Yeah, so that means Homo sapiens were hanging out in Northern Europe way earlier than we thought, even living alongside and, mixing with Neanderthals.
That is mind-blowing. And it
Yeah.
gets even more interesting because apparently those early migrations weren't just a straight shot out of Africa.
Right, more like a winding road,
Yeah.
different groups moving in different directions at different times. Some went back to where they started, others settled down in new places. It was definitely not a simple A to B kind of thing.
So it's like this big puzzle, and we're just starting to put the pieces together.
And you know what's helping us solve that puzzle? New tools. Like genomic testing. It's like having a time machine for human history.
That's awesome.
Right.
Okay, but why were those early humans so restless? Why not just stay put in one place?
Well, it all comes down to survival. They had to adapt and migrate to find food, water, shelter. You know?
It makes sense.
Plus, they had to deal with changing climates and compete with other species, even other hominins. Those migrations weren't just about finding a new home. They were about making sure our species survived.
So it's like these early journeys, driven by pure instinct, led to those encounters with other groups, like the Neanderthals we were talking about. What happened when these different groups met up?
Well, let's just say it wasn't always a peaceful hello, but those interactions, even, interbreeding, they had a huge impact on our development. The ability to adapt and learn from each other, that was key. And it's fascinating to think that we still carry traces of those ancient encounters in our DNA. We're like walking, talking evidence of those migrations.
Talk about a connection to the past. But let's fast forward a bit. What happens when agriculture comes into play? How did farming change those migration patterns?
Oh man, agriculture. Total game changer. Suddenly, humans could produce their own food, which led to settled communities and eventually those amazing ancient cities.
Right, Golden talks about cities like Lothal in the Indus Valley and Xi'an in China. They weren't just places where people lived, they were like magnets attracting diverse groups of people.
Exactly. They became hubs for trade and innovation. Remember, agriculture led to surplus, and you know what you do with surplus? Trade it. And with trade came not only goods, but also ideas, new technologies, even unfortunately sometimes diseases. It was a period of incredible cultural mixing.
And speaking of trade, we can't forget the Silk Road, that legendary network
Yeah.
connecting East and West for centuries. It was like a migration superhighway.
Absolutely. Imagine all those different people traveling that route. Traders, missionaries, diplomats, adventurers. And they weren't just walking either. We're talking camels, horses, even people living in wagons.
Wait, hold on. Living in wagons, like their permanent homes were on wheels. Okay, I got to hear more about this.
Yeah, so the Scythians, they were nomadic pastoralists. They roamed the Eurasian steppes. They adapted to this mobile lifestyle by, well, having their homes on wheels. They just packed up their lives and moved on. Imagine an entire society where home wasn't a fixed place, but something that traveled with you.
That is incredible. Talk about adaptability.
Hmm.
But it also makes you think, if home can be mobile, what does that even mean for how we see migration and belonging?
Hmm.
It's a really interesting idea.
Totally. It challenges our usual ideas of what it means to settle down, to put down roots. Maybe home is more about the people you're with, those connections you have, rather than a specific location.
So we've got trade and migration, these two powerful forces shaping civilization, spreading ideas, even changing our idea of home. But let's face it, there's also a darker side to this story.
Yeah, unfortunately, a history of migration. It's also a history of exploitation and forced displacement. And one of the darkest chapters, of course, is the transatlantic slave trade.
Golden, he doesn't shy away from the awful details. The transatlantic slave trade with millions of Africans brutally transported to the Americas. It's a stark reminder of the cruelty that can be a part of migration.
And it's especially chilling how that trade was justified. The whole racialization of slavery with blackness becoming the reason for enslavement, it shows how prejudice and power can warp how we see other people. It's a terrible example of how easily we dehumanize those who are different from us.
It's a painful reminder that even as humanity was connecting and innovating, it was also capable of unimaginable brutality. This tension between progress and exploitation, it seems to run through history, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the legacy of these forced migrations, like the transatlantic slave trade, it's still felt today. It shapes social and economic inequalities all over the world. We can't ignore it.
We can't, and we won't. But for now, we need to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more on migration.
Stay tuned. It really shows you how power can, just completely twist something as basic as people moving around. But even when we look at voluntary migration, there's always this underlying tension, right?
Yeah, it's like this constant push and pull between opportunity and fear, welcoming and, keeping people out. Which reminds me, Goldin calls the 19th century the age of mass migration. What made that time so different?
It was a period of just massive voluntary migration, like millions of people, mainly Europeans, heading to the Americas.
Aliens, wow.
Yeah, think about it. Whole families crossing the Atlantic, driven by all sorts of things. Poverty, the promise of industrialization. Even Goldin mentions this culinary preferences.
Culinary preferences. Okay, now I'm intrigued. What were people eating that made them cross entire continents? Was it like the quest for the perfect pizza?
Maybe not pizza, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
New crops and cuisines, they were introduced to Europe through trade and exploration. Some people were adventurous enough to want to try these new foods at the source. Of course, poverty and economic opportunity were huge factors too. But even something as simple as food, it could influence migration patterns.
I love the power of a good meal. But zoom out a little, what was really driving this massive movement of people?
A lot of it came down to government policies. Many countries, they actually encouraged migration to help their economies grow and fill those labor shortages. Think about the US and Australia. Their workforces grew dramatically thanks to migration. It was like a global reshuffling of people based on opportunity and need.
It's like this interconnected web, right? People moving economies, growing new cultures, taking shape.
Yeah.
But then as we move into the 20th century, things start to change, don't they?
Yeah, unfortunately. The rise of nationalism plus the aftermath of World War I, it all led to stricter borders and a less welcoming attitude towards migrants. Like the world was closing in after a period of openness.
And that's when we see passports, visas, all those stricter border control. It's almost like we invented new categories of people, the stateless, the refugee. It's heartbreaking to see how these restrictions, they often backfired and led to, real tragedies.
One of the biggest consequences was this legal limbo for refugees. As nation-states got more defined with their borders and citizenship, those who were displaced by war or persecution, they were left stranded, denied basic rights and opportunities.
It's such a paradox. The world was becoming more interconnected through technology and trade, but at the same time, more divided by political barriers. And that tension, it still shapes migration today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We live in a world where people can move more freely than ever before, but they also face more obstacles to movement.
Yeah.
It's like this constant battle between the human need to connect and the forces trying to keep us apart.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. From those early migrations out of Africa to the rise of border control in the 20th century.
Yeah.
It's like this epic story of humanity filled with both incredible achievements and, sadly, a lot of tragedies.
But we're not done yet. There's so much more to explore, especially when we look at the economic and social impacts of migration in our modern world. And believe me, there are a lot of myths out there that need busting.
Okay, I'm ready to bust some myths. Let's do it.
One of the biggest hot-button issues in migration debates is the economic impact. People worry about jobs, resources, even wages being affected. But what does the data actually tell us?
Let's get to the facts. What are we really dealing with here?
The data, it actually often contradicts those fears. Studies show that migrants can actually boost economic growth. They bring new skills, they start businesses, they contribute to the tax base.
Yeah.
Goldin, he points out some pretty impressive numbers. For instance, in the UK, migrants are expected to contribute billions to the economy by 2028. And in the US, they paid an estimated $520 billion in taxes just in 2021.
Wow, $520 billion. That's a huge contribution. And yet this idea of migrants as a drain on resources just keeps hanging around. Why do you think that is?
I think it's partly perception versus reality. It's easy to buy into those fears that paint migrants as a threat. But when you look at the evidence, it's clear that migration can be a huge economic asset.
It's like people focus on the perceived threats instead of the proven benefits. So what about that argument that migrants take jobs away from native-born workers? Any truth to that?
Not really. Studies show that migrants, they often fill jobs that locals just don't want to do or can't do, especially in areas like agriculture, construction, caregiving. Plus, they can actually create new jobs by starting businesses and boost demand. It's not a zero-sum game everybody can win.
Right. It's about creating opportunities, not taking them away.
Yeah.
And speaking of opportunities, let's talk about demographics. How does migration fit into that picture?
This is a big one. A lot of developed countries, they're facing aging populations and shrinking workforces. Migration can help by bringing in younger workers. It's a win-win situation. Countries get the workers they need, and migrants get a chance at a better life.
It's not just about economics. It's about making sure whole societies can survive in the long term. And while we're talking about positive contributions, let's not forget about remittances. Goldin really emphasizes how important those are.
Remittances, the money migrants send back to their families, they often surpass foreign aid, which is amazing. They're a lifeline for developing countries, funding education, healthcare, even small businesses.
It's incredible. Goldin says that remittances are estimated at almost $700 billion for 2023. That's a massive amount of money going straight into communities, helping families, and boosting development.
And that's just the official number. The actual amount is probably much higher because it doesn't include informal channels. It's a perfect example of how migration's impact spreads outward, way beyond the individual migrant.
It really challenges that idea of migration as a zero-sum game. It shows how movement can benefit both the countries people are leaving and the ones they're going to. But let's be realistic, there are legitimate concerns about managing migration right. It can't all be positive.
Of course, there are challenges. Managing migration effectively, it requires smart policies that address things like immigration security and, most importantly, protecting migrant rights. It's about finding the right balance.
And that's where things get complicated, right? We're seeing this rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, often fueled by fear of cultural change, competition for jobs, even terrorism. How do we navigate these really complex emotions and find some common ground?
It's definitely tough. Open and honest dialogue is crucial. We need to challenge misinformation, encourage empathy, and really focus on solutions that work for everyone. It's not about us versus them. It's about finding a way forward together.
Goldin talks about a global migration agenda. What do you think that would actually look like?
I think it starts with recognizing that migration is a global issue that requires countries to work together. We need to move away from those isolationist policies and embrace solutions that promote safe, orderly, and humane migration.
So more collaboration, shared responsibility, and focusing on what benefits everyone. But what about individual countries? How can they create policies that are effective but also compassionate?
It's about finding that sweet spot between managing migration and protecting human rights. Goldin suggests a kind of bargain where migrants agree to follow the law and contribute to society while receiving equal treatment and access to opportunities. It's a two-way street.
It sounds like a framework built on both rights and responsibilities. But putting something like that into practice, that's a whole other challenge, right? How do we go from these big ideas to real practical solutions on the ground?
Well, we need to start by tackling the root causes of migration. Poverty, conflict, climate change. These are massive, complicated issues, but we can't ignore them. We also need to invest in integration programs that help migrants learn the language, find jobs, and become active members of society.
It's about creating an environment where migrants can not just survive, but actually thrive.
Yeah.
And, speaking of changing environments, we're also seeing new migration trends, like the rise of digital nomads.
Now, this is where things get really interesting. Digital nomads, those are people who work remotely while traveling the world. They represent a whole new kind of mobility. They're not tied to those traditional ideas about work and location.
It's like the ultimate combination of work and travel. And it's all powered by technology that lets people connect and be productive from anywhere. It's like the world is their office.
It's amazing to see how technology is reshaping migration patterns, opening up new possibilities, but also creating new challenges. And then, of course, there's another major factor that's going to influence migration: climate change.
Oh, right. Gaia Vince calls it the nomad century. She says that climate change will displace millions, maybe even billions in the coming decades. What kind of impact are we talking about here?
You're already seeing it. Rising sea levels, extreme weather, resource scarcity. These are pushing people out of their homes all over the world. And these climate-induced migrations, they're only going to get worse, putting huge pressure on resources and infrastructure.
It's a sobering thought, but it also reminds us that migration isn't just something from the past. It's a critical issue that's going to shape the future of humanity. And it's not just about numbers. It's about the real human stories behind those statistics.
Exactly. We have to remember that migrants are not just data points. They're individuals with their own hopes, dreams, and goals. and their stories are essential to understanding the complexities of migration. Wow, we've really journeyed through time, haven't we?
Yeah, from those first humans leaving Africa to today with climate change driving so much movement. It's incredible.
And it's fascinating how those same themes just keep coming up over and over again.
Yeah, like that pull between staying put and exploring the constant dance between cooperation and conflict and how technology and globalization just change everything. It's all connected.
It's like this huge tapestry weaving us all together across time and space. As we try to understand migration in the 21st century, I think remembering those connections is so important, seeing ourselves reflected in those who came before us.
And those on the move right now, we're talking about millions of people with their own stories, their own hopes and dreams.
Those individual stories, they're so powerful. They remind us that migration, it's not just about numbers or policy debates. It's about real people, real lives, families, and communities.
Absolutely. And they often challenge what we think we know, too. Goldin talks about the whole brain drain idea.
Oh, right, where developing countries lose their most talented people when they migrate abroad.
Exactly. But he also talks about brain circulation
Where those migrants actually end up benefiting their home countries.
through things like remittances, investments, and sharing knowledge.
It's like a boomerang effect.
Right.
Migration can actually create this flow of resources and ideas that strengthens both the sending and receiving countries. It's not just a one-way street.
It's a great point. It shows how much potential there is in migration potential that often gets drowned out in all the arguments about border security and cultural assimilation.
We get so caught up in the economics and the politics that we sometimes forget to see the human side of things.
The resilience, the adaptability, the pure drive to create a better life that pushes so many migrants to leave everything behind and start over in a new place.
And the contributions they make to their new homes. They enrich our societies with so much diversity in terms of talents and perspectives.
So I guess the big question is this: how do we balance the very real need to manage migration with the need to protect human rights and dignity? It feels like a huge challenge.
It is a tough one. But both Goldin and Vince, they offer some really good insights. Goldin talks about the need for a new global approach to migration. One based on cooperation, shared responsibility, and recognizing the benefits that migration brings.
And Vince really wants us to rethink our whole relationship with borders and mobility in a world that's changing so fast and facing those huge challenges like climate change.
Right. She argues that we need a more fluid and adaptable approach to migration, something that lets people move safely and legally when circumstances change.
It's a pretty bold vision. It would take a big change in how we think, moving away from fear and towards a more inclusive and compassionate understanding of human mobility.
And that's where we all come in as individuals. We need to learn about the realities of migration, challenge those harmful stereotypes, and fight for policies that promote humane and sustainable solutions.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of this interconnected story, that migration isn't just something happening over there, but something that shapes all our lives and our world in really deep ways.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into migration, I want to leave you with this thought. What can we do individually and as a global community to create a future where migration is seen as an opportunity, not a threat? A future where movement isn't just a privilege for a few, but a right that's respected and protected for everyone.
That is a powerful question and one we should all consider. As you continue to learn about migration through reading conversations or even your own experiences, keep that question in mind, because the answers we find will shape not just the future of migration, but the future of humanity itself.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Until next time, keep exploring.